Hello and welcome to TG Talk, where we talk to the generation about reaching the world for Christ. Hello, I'm Bobby Bosler, and I'm grateful to have you here on the program today. We have, as you know, for the last several episodes, been working through Philippians chapter 1. Not the whole chapter, but starting at verse 12, where Paul is speaking to the Philippians about his particular situation and the fact that this situation was resulting in many people coming to Christ. It was resulting in people being spurred on to boldness. God was actually giving him potentially an opportunity to preach the gospel before Caesar. He wasn't sure how that was going to go, but he was, when he thought about it, pretty sure God was going to let him survive because the Philippians needed his input. Now, that being said, I want us to continue our study here today in verse number 27. Verse 27 is right on the heels of him saying, I'm pretty sure I know what God is doing. God's going to let me get out of here. We're going to make it through this. Verse 27 only. Let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel of Christ. Now, I mentioned this in the last episode. A lot of how we've been approaching this material has been by identifying with the Apostle Paul. In other words, we're putting ourselves in Paul's shoes. We're imagining ourselves in confinement. Not very hard to imagine these days, but we're imagining how that our testimony of boldness could influence others and that people need us just like the Philippians needed Paul to live Christ's life. But in verse 27, Paul is spinning this around now. And instead of him talking about himself and his perspective and what God's doing through his life, he puts his finger right in the face of his readers. And he says, hey, listen, now I'm talking to you, Philippians. I've got a challenge for you, Philippians. You've seen my passion. You've read about my perspective and my priorities, that I am all about Jesus and all about the gospel. Now, let me tell you, I want you to focus on this one thing. When he says only there, that is literally, again, I don't want to get too technical here, but it's literally the word one. He's saying, listen, I want you to focus on one thing, only this one thing. And here's what he said. Let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel. Now, it's important to understand the words here because there are some words that he uses in this phrase that we don't always use like this. For one, the word conversation. When we hear the word conversation, we think about a discussion that takes place between a few people. But that's not the idea of the word conversation here. In fact, it may not even be the idea that you are thinking of right now. Because let me do just a little bit of YouTube magic here. I'll bet that when you see the word conversation, hold on, got it, you're thinking lifestyle. Was I right? If I was right, tell me I was right down below in the comments. But actually, when you look at this word, though conversation isn't an incorrect gloss, there's actually a more practical picture that this word is communicating. One lexicon that I have says it this way, that it is to conduct oneself with proper reference to one's obligations in relationship to others as a part of some community. So in other words, the idea is that we exist in a collective whole. We exist in a community that is derived by individual people. And I, as a part of that community, have an obligation to live in a certain way. Now, I think this actually makes a whole lot of sense right now. Again, I'm speaking to you. I'm recording on April 1st. This is not an April Fool's Day episode, but on April 1st, our president, I think yesterday or the day before, he extended the recommendations for social distancing, for basically staying at home and only doing absolutely essential business out and about in the community. And you know what? As us, as Americans, being a part of the community of Americans or even your local community, you know what it's our ethical responsibility to do? Stay at home. Don't go out unless absolutely necessary. Do you see our role in the community involves with it certain obligations. There are things that just because we're a part of this community, we need to do. So what he says here, when he says the word conversation, that's the idea. You could say it's your political duty, or your community duty, or if I could put it another way, the idea could have the idea of this, live under obligation to your community. Okay, so with that being said, what he's saying, I want you to live under obligation, to live like a good citizen of this world by doing this. By letting your life be as it becometh the gospel of Christ. Now, there's another word we got to talk about. That word becometh. Because when we think of becoming, we think, I'm going to become a YouTube subscriber. You could do that down below. Okay, sorry, shameless plug. But when we think of become, we think we were something before and then we changed and we became something different. That is not the idea of this word become. The idea is to be worth something. In other words, your life needs to be lived worthy of the gospel. In other words, your life needs to bring worship to the gospel. Or to put it just, we kind of catch this, even though we may not be able to explain the words, you need to live your life for the gospel. It is a part of your social duty to man. In other words, my duty to my community is to live in such a way that everybody knows that Jesus died on the cross for their sins, so that everybody is brought face to face with their own sinfulness, with the reality and justice of hell, with the amazing love demonstrated in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and with the simplicity of the salvation decision that whosoever calleth upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, that believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. And he's saying, all right, hey, listen, Philippians, buddy, friends, you've seen me. I'm in jail. But you know what I'm living for? You know what my social obligation is? It is to preach the gospel to every single person that I possibly can. And hey, listen up, Philippians. If you walk away from this letter with one thing, let it be this. You need to live under obligation to preach the gospel to every creature. That's your duty. Nobody else is going to get it done for you. You need to do it. Now, he says in the next phrase here that whether I come and see you or else be absent, I may hear of your affairs. Now, he here again, and you're probably already catching this because of how much we've studied the previous context. Remember, he's not sure if he's going to survive his encounter with Caesar or whether he's going to get his head cut off. He's pretty sure he knows what God's doing. He's persuaded that God's going to bring him through this, but ultimately there's still a question mark in his mind. But he says, listen, this is how I want you to think. This is how I want you to live under obligation to the gospel, so that whether I make it out of this thing and survive or I'm looking down on you from heaven, that I can hear of your affairs. What specifically does he want to hear? That I may hear of your affairs, that ye stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. So he says, listen, whether I get out of jail and end up traveling the countryside, planting churches, preaching the gospel again, or whether I end up beheaded and looking down on you in heaven, here's what I want to hear. That you all are thinking exactly the same. I want to hear that you all have exactly the same mindset, the same perspective, the same love. That you're all about the gospel. When he says with one mind, the idea of that is like-minded. In other words, he wants everybody in their brain for it to be processing the same set of priorities, the same goals, the same thing. You ever been with somebody who's like-minded, who just thinks like you do? You know, you might both look at the same set of circumstances and you both look at each other and you know you're thinking exactly the same thing. Paul says, that's how I want you to be. I want you all, you see somebody on the street corner and you see an opportunity, you look at each other and you don't even have to say anything. You know, we got to preach the gospel to that person. Striving. I want you to know, young people, reaching the world with a gospel is going to take some work. It's not going to happen just sitting on your couch and doing nothing. It's going to require a little bit of effort. Now, again, we here at The Generation understand we do not have what it takes to accomplish the will of God in our own strength, but I think you can go to the opposite extreme and you don't give any effort to anything you're doing and, well, God's got to do it. No. Our effort is because God wants to work. And so I work because God is working in dependence upon God to work. So he's saying, listen, Philippians, and I say to you, listen, The Generation, young people, if you come away from this video with one thing, if you come away from this YouTube channel with one thing, let it be this. All of you are under obligation to the gospel. Whether you're in confinement or free like the Philippians were, you all have an obligation to think the same and to strive together to get the gospel to somebody who's never heard. Now, the real question is going to be, how are we going to do that? And in the coming days, I've got some ideas. I'm going to have to put a little bit of work into this, but I want you to stay tuned because I have some ideas and some ways that we can get the gospel out there, even in our confinement. I want to share some of those things with you. Again, keep at what God has led you to do. And again, if you want some ideas or inspiration, watch the video, Your COVID-19 Plan. In fact, oh, there it is right there. Watch that video and be encouraged by the testimony of other young people. But honestly, at the end of the day, if they do something and you don't, you have not fulfilled your obligation, your social duty. And so, young people, this is going to require a little bit of surrender in our part. It's going to require us to get desperate in prayer and to go in some way, shape, or form in dependence upon the Lord to do what we could never, ever do. And I think God would be pleased for an army of young people like you and me to mobilize and to let the gospel go viral in this world.